Okay, so it's now time to start our first dialogue conference of the morning, which will focus on cultural transfer, translation. We're very pleased to have with us two distinguished scholars who will offer complementary perspectives on this topic. I'll very shortly introduce them so we can go ahead quickly. So Professor Diana Roig-Sanz is an ICREA research professor, has been an ERC starting grant holder at the Internet Interdisciplinary Institute of the Open University of Catalonia, where she coordinates the Global Literary Studies Research Lab. And her research explores literary history from a global, decentered and interdisciplinary perspective, with a strong focus on cultural transfer and sociology of translation. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, now? Yeah. So, Dangiabel, Scarricasco, thank you very much for your invitation and for your kind introduction. And it's my pleasure to be here. I read all your profiles and you have very interesting expertise and research interest. And I hope that what we are both presenting here will talk to you and you can take some benefit from it. So, as you can read in the slide of my presentation, Diversity Matters, Cultural Sustainability in Institutionally Supported Translations, we are going to talk about translation policy, funded translations, and also sustainability. This is a research project that it was funded by the Spanish Ministry, and I'm currently leading with my colleague Laura Folica, and Ellie, she is also working with us. So this is why I will present more like the conceptual part with a few examples, and then she will go deep with the case of the Basque literature and how it works in translation. So this is my outline, and then I will start with an introduction. There are some coincidences with my previous speaker. We didn't talk, but yeah, it was nice to see that he's also working along the same lines. So I will start reminding some dates that are important for our research. 2001, this is the beginning of our research project because it was the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity. So what I would like to test is to what extent this declaration is truly implemented in the translation policies that we are promoting all over the world. In the case of the research project, we are focusing on Iberoamerica. This means Spain, Portugal, Spain, and all the languages that are co-official, and also Latin America, including Brazil. But you will see that I will show you some examples because in my next European project, I would like to deal with a larger sample of translation programs from all over the world. So another date that I would like to remind is 2005, the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. Then in 2010, UNESCO published the Atlas of the World's Language in Danger. 2013, the Black Lives Matter, also the Me Too movement that we are all involved. And then from 2022 to 2032, the UNESCO has also declared the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So all this is in the air, but we need to test empirically to what extent these intended declarations are truly implemented. So the main goal of the project is to explore literary and cultural diversity in this sample of translation programs funded by National Institute for Culture. So this means public money, public funding from the governments, but also in other public or private institutions. And you may think, for example, the George Soros Foundation They also give money to promote translations. In the case of Georgia, for example, they were also helping. No? So there are many different sort of institutions that are helping to promote translation and to promote diversity in linguistic diversity. So then we had like 3 specific goals. The first one, to examine how this works, no? How are the mechanisms through which national and regional governments they are promoting this agency in the global literary field, but also in the publishing field. And then I will talk about this, to what extent what governments are promoting, if this is aligned or not with the trends of the market, no? And some of you are working on comparative literature and science fiction, so to what extent this is aligned. And then the second specific object was to try to analyze these translation policies at different scales and to propose for these cultural, let's say, institutes, empirical research to test to what extent they are truly promoting this diversity in different terms, no? Linguistically, in terms of gender, in terms of bibliographically, and so on. And the third one was to reassert the role of these public actors in the global literary market in the sense that I was mentioning before. So as I said, the Trad Diverse project deals now with Spain and all the co-official languages, Portugal and Latin America. But as I also announced previously, my aim is to expand this research and to include other translation programs, and I have already some data for European institutions, for example, for Sweden, but also for other countries like Korea, and also from African countries, no? Because the translation policy that is promoted in the global north and in the global south is very different, and of course they don't have as many possibilities as we have in the global north. So this is something that we need to take into account. And before, no, I was thinking about Kikuyu or Yoruba, that are languages that have many speakers, and they are not visible, for example, in internet, or very little, no? So this is the digital divide, that you have many speakers, but in the internet they are completely overshadowed. So translation and politics is one of the main axes that I want to examine, to what extent geopolitical issues are impact, no, the translation policy that we are promoted. Then the gender diversity with intersectionality theory. I'm not sure if you're aware about intersectionality theory. No, this means to take into account not only gender but also race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class. So many different dimensions that of course overlap. Then linguistic diversity and bibliodiversity. This means different types of genres, no, novel, poetry, and so on, but also different types of publishers. No, it's not the same to talk about mainstream and big publishing house or a smaller one. And then the canon that we are promoting. So this is the map of some in-translation programs that you may know or not, I don't know. Creative Europe, Fund for Central and East European Book Projects, Traduki, LeadProm. This is a program promoted by the Frankfurt Book Fair in Germany, and it's for translating into German Global South languages. Then the Centre National du Livre in France, or la línea de apoyo a la traducción del libro y la lectura. And then we have another map for ex-translation programs, and this is what we are going to talk about. And you have a list of some of the programs we are currently gathering, and but I will talk about other programs too. So just to give you some framework conceptually, we apply a soft power perspective to our research, and we have published some books. You have one in the slide, Cultural Soft Power, but now we have recently published a special issue for perspectives, translation, and soft power. So we are applying interdisciplinary, and we are borrowing other concepts from other disciplines, in this case from international relations, into our research. And the progress that we are trying to promote is to understand innovatively this idea of soft power as applied to translation and cultural diversity, because of course there are many things related to cultural diplomacy that play an important role, and how many literatures, many cultures, and many countries, they try to promote themselves abroad, no? How their literatures are promoted and visibilized. Then a transregional analysis of translation flows. This is very important in terms of cultural transfer, but also in terms of entanglements, no? And it's a way to analyze all these layers at different scales. And finally, to combine analysis of state and non-state actors. And this is also very relevant because current literature has been mainly focused on state actors, but we don't take into account that there are other non-state actors that also play an important role in the circulation of languages and literatures. Here you have a slide. You can take some pictures if you want, and this is, I won't go into the details, but some literature that has dealt with politics and translation, no? Soft power, Nye, Joseph Nye, he was the first one in international relations, but then you have other references, Timochko or Alvarez and Vidal, related to power relations and the political dimension of translation, the political engagement of translators and interpreters, no? Mona Baker, Julie Boeri, and they have talked a lot about this activism, no, of translators for translating minority languages, no, in the case of the Kurds, for example, no, this has been, there is a lot of research on it. And then soft power, culture and translation, Luis Fonflotto in Canada, Catherine Batchelor, and then our own work, no, the book that I was showing before and the special issue I was just mentioning. Translation and political institutions, Ismail Hadadian Moghadam, he's from Iran. Translation policy, my colleague Raina Mailaerts, and also Elizabeth Carbó-Catalán, who was one of my PhD students. And then international relations and cultural diversity, a bit along the lines of my previous speaker. So a second conceptual framework that I would like to bring today here is a big translation history approach. And this means to apply, and this is what we are doing, to apply data-driven perspectives and what has been called computational humanities into our research. So this is also part of our future, no? Of course, now in artificial intelligence, and then machine learning, natural language processing. So you have many tools and many different techniques that you can apply to our research. And in this case, with my colleague Laura Folica, we propose this term, big translation history, which means to apply larger scale research, no? Working with data from many different geographical, linguistic, and chronological spaces. Also apply big and little data, because in the humanities, in our research, there is a big debate about what big data means for us, no? And it's very different for what big data means for an engineer, no? It's nothing to do. So this is a very interesting reflection, and we work with heterogeneous and non-structured sources. For many of these languages, no, indigenous languages, you can imagine that we have very little data, also because these languages, they don't have a tradition of written culture, and this is a problem if we want to work, no, from a data-driven perspective. So now, how to think all this? And then the use of computational techniques as part of the research process. Our visualizations are not the outcome, but are part of the research. And here you have also some references and a book about Joanna Drucker on visual forms of knowledge production. Then a third conceptual framework that we are applying to our research and that I'm proposing here is a global approach to translation history and the idea of the global minor. This is a paper I wrote for a special issue in comparative literature studies, and I was reflecting about all this, no? How to propose a more horizontal model, a more inclusive model where all these literatures and languages that are supposed to be centered and peripheral, dominated and dominant, are more horizontal, no? Let's say, and I was referring to less translated, small, minor, minoritized, and so on. And then the progress that we propose is this focus on the entanglements between languages, cultures, and literatures, and also their agents involved. And here you need to think not only on translators, but also on publishers, literary agents, the writers themselves, the directors of these national institutes for culture, and scouts, and many different agents that are involved, human and non-human, of course, prices, book fairs, and the market, the literary and publishing market on the whole. And finally, this more inclusive regarding these less translated languages and minoritized communities, and this is why I'm using intersectionality theory. Finally, another conceptual framework is the idea of biocultural diversity. And I understand nature and culture as two angles of a single entity. I think that today, and as my previous speaker was also mentioning, we need to understand them in the same way, because this is our future, to make that our planet is more sustainable. So what I'm trying to propose in this larger project is to compare biodiversity and cultural diversity. And from the perspective of ecolinguistics, it has been shown that in those places in the planet where you may find more biodiversity, the tropic, you also find more languages. So is this true? Of course, in the case of cultural ecosystems, how can we test all these ideas? Why the global north is less biodiverse? Maybe because of climate change conditions, or because of climate conditions, because it's colder, and then natural species cannot resist as much as they can in this tropic where the climate is more stable. So all these very interesting reflections, you can apply them to your research, and I'm applying also to mine. So it's a way to preserve both biological and cultural diversity. And what I'm proposing is the term cultural ecological hope spots, where those languages and literatures are more resilient, because ecologists, they talk about social ecological hope spots. So I was transferring this term and using the term of cultural ecological hope spots. So how language and literatures are more or less resilient, and why to struggle the dominance and marginality of many languages. And then again, how can we advance towards a more culturally sustainable world? And how I'm going to do this? So I'm using mechanisms that ecologists are proposing to analyze the biodiversity of an ecosystem, and you may think about resilience, but also danger, extinction, low variability, adaptability. So you may apply this mechanism to cultural ecosystems, to analyze to what extent these cultural ecosystems are more or less resilient, or to what extent they are more or less adaptable, or the low or higher variability in terms of how many books are translated and the diversity of these books and so on. So you can use all these terms. So just to go a bit faster, the hypothesis of the project is that our planet and our society are bioculturally diverse. We assume that this works like this. Then we understand cultural diversity in a broad sense, and as I was saying, gender, linguistically, and bibliographically. And then we think that translation policies are an effective tool for nation branding and soft power, but we need to take in mind, and we need to transfer the message that sustainability is another important point, and this is why the 18th goal is completely needed. Then translation policies are increasingly aligned with the market trends, and this is also something that we are trying to test, and I think that it works also like this. And of course, the books that are translated also correspond to our social debates, And then in terms of gender equality, there are more women that are translated, women writers, and also more women translators, but also women and men of migrant or ethnic origins, and also in terms of topics. You can find more translated books that reflect about environmental issues, about climate change, about imaginaries of the future, about science fiction, about the post-human, and so on. So all this is reflected in the books that are funded. And very briefly, I would like to talk about the data. You may have heard about FAIR data, no? Which means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But I also want to point out to the CARE principles for indigenous data governance that are more new. And this means that we need to take into account in our data-driven approaches the indigenous knowledge, no, and to reconcile two different cosmovisions, no, our Western, no, let's say, view with the cosmovision of indigenous people, no, that it's completely different. So when we apply data to our research, we need to combine both. I won't talk about the data because she will talk about this. And then some research questions very quickly, and I will show you to conclude a few examples. No? So what kind of impact in literary and cultural diversity do politics have? Do change in government affect the increase or drop of subsidies and funded translations? And the answer is yes, of course. Depending on the government and depending on the stability of the country, this will change. Then what kind of gender diversity do translation policies promote, and if this representation reinforce or oppose the one proposed by the publishing market, the publishing market is pushing forward the translation and circulation of women writers, that what kind of linguistic diversity do these translation policies encourage, and to what extent they exclude or include indigenous or co-official languages. In the case of Latin America, I can already say that indigenous languages are still completely overshadowed. The translation programs of Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, they don't include the translation of indigenous languages, so this is a problem, and this is why I hope to contribute with this research, with a final report that I will deliver and submit to this national institute, so that they can be more aware about that they are not truly promoting cultural diversity, and then what kind of bibliodiversity do these translation policies enhance, and finally the idea of the canon, no? What canon is promoted abroad. So just to give you a few examples, about all these countries, no? Sweden, Korea, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Russia, Colombia, and Uruguay. This is a few examples, but we have more data on other countries, like, for example, Tamil in India. No? They also have a program for translation. So we have more than 10,000 translations for this period between 2001 and 2023, and more than a third are translations funded by Sweden. That, of course, is a richer country and with a greater stability in terms of politics. So what I was mentioning before, no, translation and politics, for example, in the case where democracy is more unstable, in the case of Russia and Argentina, the change of governments significantly impacts in the translations that are funded. In the case of Argentina, no, two years ago already, Milei, no, the new president of Argentina, the subsidies for translation decreased, but very, very significantly, and you have the data on the slide, no, from 123 translations to only 10 titles in 2024. So you can imagine, no, like the importance that Milei is giving to cultural diversity and to translation, nothing at all. And in countries with greater stability, these changes affect less. So in the case of Sweden and Korea, it doesn't really matter if the government change, because what they will do is to preserve and to maintain the translation policy and to preserve the translation policy of the previous government. It doesn't matter if it's right, left, whatever. And finally, there are other geopolitical events that have a great contribution on this. For example, the Frankfurt Book Fair. When you may have heard that the Frankfurt Book Fair, they have the guest of honor cultures. So in this case, Brazil, Argentina, for example, they were obliged to create a translation program so that they could be invited to be the guest of honor, no? So yeah, that was the way that they start promoting these programs. You may see here translation and politics, Korea and Russia, since the creation of these programs. In the case of Korea, no, it increases more or less. It's there are not big changes, no. And in the case of Russia, it's very different. And of course, from the time of the war with Ukraine, it's even worse, no? So this, of course, it also important. And a very important thing is that many of these translation subsidies are asked by foreign publishers. So this means that these foreign publishers are less interested in Russian literature because of political reasons, no? So this is also a very important thing. And the other way around, in the case of Ukraine, there is much more interest now in translating Ukraine literature because of political reasons too. So in terms of gender, you may see here, no, like the different countries that I was mentioning. You can see that in the case of Sweden, the proportion of translated women Swedish writers is more or less the same from the very beginning. No, you have 50, more or less, no, 50%, 40%, but it's not the same for the rest of countries with more men than women, no? So gender diversity, no, in the other cases, no? And in the case of women, so this consistent translation of women for the case of Sweden, it's not in the case of Argentina and Russia, and only in 2022 there are more Russian women writers that are translated, but my hypothesis is that this has to do with this trend in the market to promote more women writers, so this affects also Russian women writers, but also in the case of female Russian dissident writers. So they are also more translated, again, for political reasons. And just to conclude, here you have Korean authors. In yellow, men, Han Kang, Nobel Prize now. No, so you can see that there are many Korean women writers that are translated abroad. In the case of Argentina, less. And I can say that these women who are translated are very contemporary, so this may have to do with this Me Too movement, no, and these women that are writing about maternity and about how to be a woman in 2025, or climate change, or topics that are very much aligned with the interests of the publishing market. And the men that are translated are canonical, Julio Cortázar, Borges, and so on, no? So are not as contemporary as in the case of women. And in the case of Russian authors, even less women, no, in yellow again. And those who are men are also canonical, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on. So these are some references. You can take a picture if you want because I would like to show you just the last thing. Are references of our own research in the research group, in terms of global perspective into translation, a paper on global translation history in translation and society, the journal that Luc van der Slaer is editing, and you can propose your research to this journal. And then also in terms of cultural mediation, and within our field, but also in another field. So I will try to go here. No, okay. No, okay. Well, doesn't matter. So this was, it's all the data that we have, and I could show you some nice graphs. Thank you very much. Eskerrik asko. Danjabel, moltes gràcies. This is in Catalan. I'm a Catalan native speaker, so I'm also a speaker from a minority language, or less translated, small, whatever. Thank you.